If you ask the average person to describe a monk, you'll either get a fairly accurate description of a Franciscan friar, all the way down to the rope belt, or a description influenced by kung fu films of a usually Shaolin Buddhist monk. These aren't wrong, but our standard modern perception of monks misses out on so much historical nuance, bizarre and fascinating practices that I really think it needs addressing. I would love to start, like every terrible presentation ever made, with a discussion on the definition of monk. Monks live a monastic lifestyle, which comes from the Greek term monatsein, meaning to live alone. This is why it's so strange that the majority of modern imaginings of monastic life involve usually a group of men living together in a small community. Well, the reason for that is organised faith, or the establishment of a church or sect mentality. The earliest monks, at least in the Western tradition, were actually ascetics, who lived alone and did some weird stuff. They lived in accordance with this sense of spiritual labour, where they did these devotional practices on their own usually, that were hard on the body and were supposed to be spiritually rigorous. They were the earliest mad religious eccentrics and often lived strange lives. We'll talk about some of those specifics later. I will therefore, throughout this video, be using monk and ascetic roughly interchangeably, and if that ruffles your feathers, then oh boy, we're going to have a very interesting comment section on this one. So, with the advent of truly organised religion, and especially the mainstream adoption of Christianity into especially Roman public life, these holy men need to be reined in, controlled, not only so they can preach the new orthodox established teachings, but also to avoid these dangerous charismatic personality cults from springing up around these unorthodox weirdos. So, monastic communities are developed, moving from the late 200s to the 300s, and since then the individual who is living alone in their relationship with faith has somewhat dried up as a concept. It's not dead, that's for sure, but there are fewer of them. But enough of a history lesson. Let's dive into some of the weird and wonderful varieties of ascetic and monastic practices in history. I hope you're going to come away with a deeper understanding of these practices, or if you know a lot already, with a ton of new ways to integrate these real-life monastic practices into your world building. Let's start with a fun type of ascetic, the Stylite. These are individuals who decide to spend their lives, often silently, sitting or standing on pillars, either in the centre of cities or somewhere on the outskirts. It's a devotional challenge, almost like a modern day Mr. Beast video, only self-imposed and for the purposes of deepening devotion to their deity and spiritually perfecting themselves. These Stylites braced the elements and relied entirely on food and drink donations to actually keep themselves alive. In a world of magic, where threats can reasonably come from anywhere, from monsters to man, this practice might be even more absurd. Risking the ire of harpies, wyverns, manticores, and other monstrous flying beasts is an even more mad task, especially if you're devoting your asceticism to a single deity. If anyone catches wind and dislikes your faith expression, or even dislikes the deity you are devoting yourself to, then you'll have them to deal with too, as opposed to in our world's Stylites, who were mostly set up in countries and communities who were already suffused with their faith. A fantasy monk or ascetic trying to bring up this strange practice may find themselves a master of the elements, gaining some control of local weather, or maybe gaining divine powers from their chosen deity or deities. Or, if this is some journey of self-improvement in addition, learning some of the weaknesses and ways to handle some of these flying, troublesome monsters who harass them every single day. Heck, perhaps even their body and mind and skills have been honed perfectly in fighting these flying beasts who have been harassing them while standing on top of the pillar. And so they have developed new techniques for aerial combat, perhaps. There are plenty of ways that the Stylite could improve themselves, or improve their relationship with a particular deity, but a Stylite in a fantasy world would needs have a tougher time than in our world, at least. If, frankly, that is even possible. We should probably address the notion of the warrior monk next. From the Teutonic Order to the Sohe, we see around the world and across history religious orders devoted to monastic devotional practice alongside training as warriors. These organised folks have various levels of formalisation in their practice, ranging from the relatively strictly celibate barracks of the Teutons to the loosely organised Iko-Iki, who were a coalition of lay people / freedom fighters who shared the same sectarian fate and some monastic practices. Whichever of these disparate groups we choose to label with the term a monastic order, the fact remains that sectarian warriors with relatively formalised devotional practices as a base are much more common throughout history than most people assume. The argument is always whether the monastic or brotherly element comes first or the warrior identity is actually primary, but it is inevitable in a world suffused with religion that religious orders of devotional fundamentalists are important in the history of human war, and this fact may even be better represented in a fantasy world. Perhaps instead of the oh-so-tired cult being the primary mode of engagement with sectarian faith expressions in fantasy, we could explore what happens when a devotional monastic style faith takes war, combat, or protection among their tenets. Who knows, maybe a monastic sect of a city's protector deity controls literally a third of the militia, with the rest of the citizens being unsure what to think about these strict ascetics who have odd isolationist practices. Yes, they may protect the city well, and yes, their isolationist training is done in the name of the city's guardian deity, but are we sure that they're still on our side? Are we sure they're more devoted to upholding the city's laws than the laws of their own monastic order? Or is this just a private army run by a sectarian zealot? Who knows? Perhaps instead of your classic knightly retainers and personal guards of a king, we could have an organisation of monastic-styled devotees to the state faith or state pantheon, maybe leaning into these kind of more Shaolin or Kung Fu styles of protection. There are tons of fascinating monastic traditions from around the world and throughout history. So now we're going to go a little more quickfire. There are communities of ascetics, for example, who ritually cover themselves in cremated human remains, although whether the Agori community identifies as monastic is a matter of some debate. There have been many examples of flagellants throughout history, as well as ascetic wanderers who often travelled the land barefoot. Some choose to live and sleep in coffins in order to prepare for their own death, and others eschew clothes, turn relatively feral, and live off the land. Some of these people would be deemed mad in modernity, but almost all of them are venerated, at least by their own traditions. That's the thing. For anyone who gets them, these ascetics are publicly and seriously undertaking a devotional worship most people don't feel like they are capable of. And that's why in so many cases these people doing strange things received gifts, funds and support from local communities, because the people who wouldn't or couldn't do it feel that supporting these ascetics is an act that bolsters their own faith. This is actually especially meaningful in fantasy, as the genre tends towards deities which are actively involved in granting power, magic and influencing the world. Due to this, charismatic priests with divine magic become very important figures. See my video on fantasy pantheons for more on that. For now, what we really need to know is that most of these ascetics almost certainly have their deities or deities' favour. Perhaps our ascetic monks who choose to embrace death by living inside their own graves to be, like Simeon the Ancient, would please a god of death, but also minor gods of funerary rites, preparations, and perhaps any deity with an intensely ritualistic or nihilistic streak. The site of their devotion may become a place for gathering of other followers of these types of deity, and the ascetic may find themselves almost unwittingly surrounded by a community of followers, perhaps begging for advice in all things death. Indeed, another saintly Simeon, the Syrian Stylite, was famed for the community who gathered around his pillar to ask him for advice, and during his 37 years on the pillar, he was regularly delivered food by a community of young lads who kept climbing up to deliver his lunch to him. Perhaps instead of a traditional hedge preacher, your world's villages can instead be visited by an ascetic instead, which will make for a far more dynamic tale. Perhaps a barefooted wanderer in the Russian style, on their way through town on their ascetic journey, comes to the town square, seeking alms and support from any who wish the barefoot wanderer to take with them prayers to a far, far away holy place that they are on their way towards. These ascetics prided themselves on giving practical advice, ritual expertise, and living a life free from other burdens, such as possessions or statehood, the abandonment of which allowed them to travel, pilgrimage, and help folks around a large region. Maybe a flagellant ascetic comes through town instead. Although, like the barefoot wanderer, they suffer for their devotion, for the flagellant or self-tormentor, the suffering is rather the point. Sometimes they wore chains under their clothes just to weigh them down, or heavy metal boots. Others did sometimes whip themselves, yet more simply wore sharp, uncomfortable, scratchy garments, often with heavy things underneath. This was done sometimes to prepare for an afterlife of eternal torment, or often to suffer in this life to get closer to their God, who had often, in the Christian sense, suffered through Jesus. A god of pain is a reasonable thing to join with this practice, but equally deities of justice, sacrifice, illness, forgiveness, or penitence may be served by such practices in a fantasy setting. In our world, even these ascetics often gathered followers. So imagine a world where their extreme methods actually get tangible results and rewards in this life. If the Lord of Penitence rewards you and gives you great power for wandering the lands with chains wrapped around your body, you're not only going to be one of the most interesting people to wander through a village in years, you're also well on your way to becoming an anime character. Unfortunately, many of my examples have come from a Western Christian perspective. Today, the monastic tradition that I've been talking about most is a Mediterranean and ancient Near East invention, but has yet convergently evolved into similar monastic practices, alongside especially the Buddhist faith from the 6th century onwards. My knowledge in these practices is far more limited, so it may be wiser for me to defer to more knowledgeable peers in this particular regard. I can highly recommend Extra History series on the Buddhist expansion for some solid background, but please do let me know if you find anything more specific. The thing is, the monk, at least in D&D, has so often been orientalized relatively unsuccessfully. And in fantasy more broadly, the conception of a monk is either martial art master or beer brewing religious celibate. I think we can just be more interesting. The monastic and ascetic traditions of Syria, Russia, and far beyond are utterly fascinating, and fertile ground for many more stories than one may think. Heck, you want some grim dark inspiration? Read up on the early Christian martyrs. So let's all agree to do more with the monk in fantasy, because ascetics and monks are pretty foundational to the way we observe many faiths. I mean, Christianity has ascetics before they're properly sure about the nature of the Trinity, for goodness sake. Although a quick disclaimer, I am here talking about the Council of Nicaea. There are various other doctrinal disagreements about the Trinity, but please, this video will be an hour long. So, before I annoy anyone else, I fear I may have already started several wars in the comments section, I'm gonna wrap up. But as usual, the bottom line is, interrogate your assumptions and learn what you can about real life, because it's really quite remarkable. If you find yourself wanting more videos like this, do please subscribe so that I know what to make next. So with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.